If you haven't watched modules 1, 2, and 3, we encourage you to do so. Module 1 provides an introduction to BC OHRC. It offers an overview of the entire session and explains how to use the different components of this web-based learning session. Module 2 reviews the characteristics of systemic discrimination and considers the importance of taking action. And Module 3 provides tools to identify an example of systemic discrimination. As with previous modules, we'll ask you to pause and reflect during this session. So consider having a pen and paper available to write down your thoughts if you find that helpful. Let's have a look at what we covered already. In Module 2, we reviewed the key characteristics and impacts of systemic discrimination, and we considered reasons for taking action to address it. In Module 3, we reflected on examples of systemic discrimination. In this module, we will become familiar with potential actions for your settings, both in your organization and in daily life. But first, we'll explore a few frameworks that may be helpful.
Actions to address systemic discrimination can occur at different levels. This is a tool to consider the appropriate level of action that you may wish to take. And later in the session, we're going to provide examples of actions at each of these levels. If we start at the bottom of the pyramid, we can see that personal actions are an important first step. These can include actions to take care of ourselves, learn more, and change our attitudes and behaviors. Awareness raising appears above personal actions on the pyramid. Once you're ready at a personal level, you can consider raising awareness amongst your friends, family, and within your organization or community. Advocacy for policy change may be possible once people are aware of an issue. This includes identifying existing issues and speaking up for positive change in government, in your community, and your workplace. Policy change within organization appears at the top of this pyramid. This involves implementing changes in policies, practices, and behaviors within your organization, within your community, and within your workplace. You'll notice that legal actions appear along the side of the pyramid. Sometimes these actions can result in systemic change. The pyramid demonstrates how taking action at one level can support action taken at the level above it with the final goal of policy change. But it's important to note that actions at higher levels can also lead to changes at the levels below them. An example of this is changes in policy that can lead to growing awareness over time. For example, seatbelt laws. When those were put into place through legal change in our province, they resulted in an increased awareness of the importance of seatbelt use over time. The decision to take action is personal, and it can depend on many factors, including time, level of interest, personal safety, and ability to make change within communities. In addition to occurring at different levels, actions can have different scales and scopes. Broad-scale actions can take place across a society or in many different sites. These are often the starting point for other types of actions. Localized actions, on the other hand, take place and impact one specific site. These actions can also take place at the individual level. Actions within one location can support and inspire actions at other locations. Later in this session, while looking at specific examples of actions, we're going to think about how actions at a larger or smaller scale can support these actions. In the Introduction to Systemic Discrimination session, we included a video about 3 community members who shared their experiences with systemic discrimination. In this video, Lauren, Anthony, and Brandon again discussed their experiences of systemic discrimination and some of the actions that they're involved in to address systemic discrimination. While watching, you might want to consider the scope of these actions. Are they individual? Are they localized? Or are they broad scale? And you might also want to think about the level of action they're taking. Is it personal, awareness raising, advocacy, or policy change?
Lauren, Anthony, and Brandon are taking different actions to address systemic discrimination. As you watch this video, think about the types of actions they are taking and how they might contribute to change. As a wheelchair user, Lauren has identified barriers to accessing tables in a restaurant. How might the following action address this issue?
We often talk about sexism, racism, homophobia, but we don't talk about ableism. Even though the disabled community is the largest minority group in the world.
With the Rewrite Rules campaign, we want to invite you to unpack how ableism holds us all back and to inspire action for all of us to take steps to make our communities more inclusive and equitable.
Unwritten rule number 3. If you can't get up the steps, just go somewhere else, right? Wrong. To support disabled people, change the space, not the people. Let's #rewrite the rules. Anthony has noticed a relationship between systemic racism and the absence of Black history in schools. What are some impacts of the actions he is proposing?
I want to write stories that tell the truth, and I want to put it in the public school system as a learning tool. We have to be better as teachers. We have to be better as parents to teach our kids properly. And sooner or later, this attitude of racism, hopefully, if everybody can just do their little bit, things will change. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the future. I really wanted to say that.
Brandon has experienced systemic barriers as a gay Asian man. How might his actions help address this issue?
Queer joy is central to a lot of the activism that I've done in my work. We're typically inundated with these messages that when you're gay or trans, your life will be hard. The counterbalance to that is queer joy, and you see that in a lot of new media, especially more independent media done by queer and trans artists. The power of that positive influence is about creating that mental picture of possibility. What would it be like to be your full self, to be seen and to be accepted and to succeed as a whole human being? The more you know yourself, the more you're able to advocate for your community as well.
What actions are Lauren, Anthony, and Brandon taking to address systemic discrimination? How could these actions result in systemic change? What can you do to help end systemic discrimination?
You may have noticed that Lauren, Anthony, and Brandon all participated in actions at the awareness raising level, although the scale and scope of their actions was different. For example, the Rewrite the Rules campaign Lauren supported is a broad-scale provincial action, whereas Anthony's writing stories for schools is a localized action, and his conversations with parents and teachers to do their bit are individual actions. And Brandon's promotion of joy in queer identity with individuals and through the media is both individual and broad scale. Lauren, Anthony, and Brandon may have chosen the level of awareness raising because it can often be an important first step for actions. This level of action is important because it helps people understand why addressing specific examples of systemic discrimination is important. But if actions begin and ends with awareness raising, there's no guarantee systemic discrimination will be addressed. Later, we'll see how we can build increased awareness through advocacy and policy change. Now that we've reviewed systemic discrimination and introduced some frameworks to think about scope and scale and levels of action, you may have some ideas of actions that have already been taken. Some examples of well-known actions include demonstrations and online petitions to address systemic racism against Black people, or implementing truth and reconciliation calls to action to address systemic discrimination against Indigenous people, or changing hiring policies to increase the proportion of women and racialized people within an organization. You may have an example of an action taken in response to another problem within your organization or community. Take a minute to reflect on and record an action or actions that come to mind. How successful was that action? What are some factors that helped make that action successful? Were there barriers to that success? And finally, if your initial goals were not met, could the action still be considered successful? Next, we're going to look at a few guidelines for successful actions. As we present these guidelines, consider which you are aware of, which might be new to you, and which you might find useful. Your handout package includes guiding questions to identify if each guideline is being met. Actions may be successful if they do the following. If the action centers the voices of people impacted by the issue so that those impacted are involved in both identifying the issue and developing a response. If the action addresses the root causes of the issue rather than just its impacts. If the action contributes to systemic and permanent change through changes in policies, laws, practices, including attitudes and behaviors. If the action has flexible timelines and outcomes. Systemic discrimination is deeply embedded and normalized, so it can take time to address it. Setting short and medium-term goals can show the group working on an action that positive change is indeed occurring. And sometimes the result of actions may be different from their original goals. But if the results contribute, even in small ways, to addressing systemic discrimination, then they should always be considered successful. Developing successful actions also depends on considering the potential barriers to actions and then developing strategies to overcome them. Let's look at a few barriers now. For example, limited capacity. Timelines and the number of people involved may limit your ability to carry out an action. Some possible solutions can include extending your timelines and engaging more people. Another barrier might be missing skills. So, for example, the actions may require skills that your group does not possess. Some possible solutions could include recruiting people with those skills or taking training to develop them. Another barrier is lack of influence. So having no access to decision makers can prevent changes from being put in place. Some possible solutions include beginning with awareness raising activities to expand your group to include decision makers, or engaging people with access to decision makers. Another important barrier is risks to safety or well-being. Participating in actions may pose risks to your safety or well-being. Some possible solutions include expanding your team of people taking action together and recruiting allies who are at lower risk of harm to speak on behalf of the group. If none of these solutions successfully addresses the barriers, you may need to consider a different action. Before sharing examples of successful actions, take a minute to reflect on the action you identified in the previous slide. Were essential components considered? Were potential barriers addressed?
Over the next few slides, we'll share some examples of actions to address systemic discrimination at each level. We only have time now to share a few details about each example, but more information about each of these, as well as additional actions, are available in your handout package. We'll begin by sharing a few personal actions. One personal action is self-care. Taking action on systemic discrimination can have impacts on well-being, especially for those directly impacted. You can check out our supports in our handout, which may be helpful. In addition, building connections with others who are also impacted can be a really big help. Another personal action is using our Noticing Discrimination checklist. Checklists shared earlier for identifying systemic discrimination in organization and daily lives are useful tools to support personal learning before considering higher levels of action. Learning about systemic discrimination is an important personal action, no matter what level you are in your understanding. BCOHRC's Systemic Discrimination Toolkit includes videos, an infographic and conversation guide, a web page, workshops, and experiential learning sessions to support learning. When learning about systemic discrimination, you may come across misinformation and intentional disinformation, which is available online and in the media. This can often lead us in the wrong direction. Our office has developed a campaign on mis and disinformation. It includes information and tools to identify and address mis and disinformation, and you can find them on our misinformation webpage. With each level of action, we've posted the scale and the scope and the connected social movements on each slide. But because of time limitations, we won't describe these during this session, but they'll appear in your PDF of the presentation and can be used to support reflection when you plan your own actions. Now we'll share a few examples of actions taken to raise awareness of specific issues related to systemic discrimination. Rewrite the Rules is an example of the campaigns BCOHRC has developed to raise awareness about human rights in our province. This campaign uses posters, video, social media posts, and local events. And the goal of the campaign was to inspire conversations and encourage reflection about systemic discrimination against people with physical and mental disabilities. Many other groups have taken action on systemic discrimination with strong and lasting impact, and we'll share one example of one of these actions at each level. The Moosehide campaign began in British Columbia as an Indigenous-led grassroots movement. It raises awareness about roles of men and boys in ending violence against women and children. And it has become a movement across Canada of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in different settings. Advocacy for policy change can be effective if there is already a good level of awareness about the issue. And here are a few examples. Equity is Safer, Human Rights Consideration for Policing Reform in British Columbia is a report that our office developed. It uses what we call disaggregated data. Now, disaggregated data is data that helps to identify and compare how different groups are harmed by policies, practices, and behaviors. The report raises awareness by highlighting alarming differences in how Indigenous and racialized peoples are treated in policing compared to other groups in our province. The report also advocates for change by recommending reforming policies and practices in policing to reduce systemic racism and improve safety and equity. Sanctuary Cities Vancouver is an example of advocacy work done outside of our office. Many factors contribute to large numbers of our residents in our province not having immigration status. Examples of some of these factors include threats to safety and slow immigration processing times. Sanctuary City Vancouver advocates for Vancouver to become a sanctuary city where all residents have access to services. It provides tools and strategies to address barriers to accessing municipal, school, and health-related services. Sanctuary City Vancouver's website provides resources to groups that wish to take similar actions, and it includes research papers, data, and advocacy letters that you can use as templates. Again, here are the scale of the action and related social movements. Making changes in policy and practices is the level of action with the most immediate impacts on systemic discrimination. It often occurs after actions to raise awareness and advocate for policy change have been carried out. Changes in policies and practices can also impact systemic discrimination that shows up as widely accepted attitudes and behaviors. And unlike other levels, this action can only be carried out by people with decision-making power within an organization. We'll look at a few examples. BC OHRC's Employment Equity Toolkit provides employers with tools to guide changes in policies and practices. Employment equity involves employers working to remove and prevent barriers for workers who belong to groups that have often been treated unfairly because of their race, age, gender, disability, or another characteristic. This toolkit includes information sheets and additional resources to guide policy change, and it focuses on 5 areas. One area is accommodations, changes to working conditions that will decrease barriers. It also includes a section on compensation or salaries, and it focuses also on collecting data, responding to and addressing complaints, and hiring and promotion. The BC Teachers Federation has developed policies to improve equity and inclusion within the provincial and local unions. These policy changes occurred after actions to raise awareness and advocate for change were carried out. Some examples of these policy changes include a review of systemic racism within the Federation, issue sessions for members from specific identity groups, dedicated staff positions focused on equity and inclusion, dedicated executive committee positions for members from equity-deserving groups, and a grant to support local teachers' unions with improving equity within their policies and practices. Once again, pulling up some information about the scale of action and related social movements. In certain cases, legal actions can be an effective strategy to address systemic discrimination. Human rights complaints can be brought forward through several legal pathways. These include lodging complaints with BC's Human Rights Tribunal or the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, or filing a constitutional challenge, or filing a submission with an international human rights body. The pathway to follow depends on the nature of the complaint and the jurisdiction that it falls under. And more information on this is available in your handout. On all levels, except for international human rights bodies, if it is legally determined that systemic discrimination has occurred, a systemic remedy may be issued. And this can include demanding changes in policy and practices to prevent this type of discrimination from occurring again. An example of this is the Mayorin case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. It identified systemic discrimination against women related to mandatory fitness requirements for firefighters. And the systemic remedy included changes to how discrimination is identified in our province. Information about this case is available in the handout. And you can learn more about legal action through our Human Rights Code educational sessions. Registration information about these sessions is available on our events webpage.
Taking action on systemic discrimination within your organization or community can be simpler and on a smaller scale than the examples we have just provided. We'll consider each level of actions now. Starting with personal actions, these may include learning more about systemic discrimination, gathering information about what is happening in your setting, and also taking care of your own needs. Next, consider actions to raise awareness about the issue. First, if you're not personally impacted, invite people most impacted by the issue to be involved in the planning process. Then identify what information will help communicate the impacts of the issue and why it's so important to address. You can share impacts both on specific groups and on the organization or community as a whole. You can include personal stories as well as quotes and data about which groups are impacted and the frequency of the impacts. Then you can identify the approach you'll use to communicate that information that you've gathered. Some examples might be informal conversations, meetings, presentations, written reports, pamphlets, or posters, or audio and video recordings. Once people in your setting are aware of the issue, consider advocating for policy change. Begin by identifying which changes are needed. Centering the voices of those groups impacted by systemic discrimination is essential to effective policy change. Ask these groups to identify which policies or ways of doing things are contributing to barriers and harms, and which policy changes are needed. Consider consulting the BCUHRC Employment Equity Toolkit and other resources shared in our handout for examples of policies. Then advocate for change by identifying and sharing the information that will show the change you'd like to see happen and why it's important, including the impacts of existing policies and practices, the change that would address these impacts, how taking action will benefit groups impacted, and how the organization or community as a whole will benefit from these changes. You can also include examples of successful changes in other settings. Once new policies have been developed, ask the employer or those in charge of the organization or group to implement strategies to help ensure the success of these changes. These can include providing education to raise awareness about the importance of these changes and support their implementation. Can also include monitoring and evaluating these changes over time. If they aren't successful, the policies or the supports for implementing them may need to be revised. You may also wish to consider legal action to address systemic discrimination within your setting. Consult the Human Rights Tribunal website or attend our Human Rights Code sessions to learn more. Now that we've looked at some examples of actions at each level, let's take a few minutes to reflect. Which level or levels of action might be effective in addressing systemic discrimination in your community or organization? You may want to identify more than one. Personal actions, awareness raising, advocacy for policy change, legal action, or none at this time. And can you think of an action at this level that might be effective? We hope these examples and frameworks have helped you to begin identifying potential actions. If not, we encourage you to look at the handout package for this module, which includes additional examples of actions at each level.
We're coming to the end of this module, and in the next module, we'll look at next steps for getting started on taking action to address systemic discrimination. Before proceeding to Module 5, we invite you to download the PDF of the presentation for Module 4, as well as the handout package. The handouts include an infographic of levels of actions, our successful actions guidelines, and examples of actions at each level. Thank you for participating in Module 4 of Systemic Discrimination Part 2, What We Can Do.